Everyone. I have the pleasure to introduce Kirsten Maertens, who is a professor at our University of Antwerp, within the Center for the Evaluation of Vaccination. And Kirsten defended her PhD a few years ago on pertussis vaccination during pregnancy, scientific evidence behind recommendation. In the meantime, Kirsten is heading a team of researchers and nurses working on projects related to maternal immunization, but much broader than pertussis immunization only. And she will cover the topic of maternal vaccine and vaccination research, the challenges and the strategies and the successes in the, I would say, next 45 minutes, something like that. And then we have time to pick up a number of questions so that we can close the whole presentation and discussion in 1 hour. So Kirsten, the floor is yours.
So thank you for the nice introduction. So in the next 40 to 45 minutes, I will talk to you about maternal vaccine research challenges and vaccine strategies and successes. So a first question that we need to ask ourselves today is, why do we actually vaccinate during pregnancy? So if we look at global maternal mortality in the year 2015, we can see that in that year, 216 per 100,000 live births resulted in a maternal death, which corresponds with 303,000 maternal deaths overall in that year. And this is 813 deaths per day. 99% of these maternal deaths occurred in low middle income countries, and most of them were pregnancy and childbirth related complications, but also infectious diseases contributed to these maternal deaths. And if we then look at the global child mortality in that same year, 5.9 million deaths in children below 5 years of age were seen, of which 2.7 million deaths occurred in the immediate neonatal period. And infectious diseases have a high contribution in the number of deaths. So due to the fact that we see a lot of deaths in women and children, and some of them or most of them are infectious disease related, maternal vaccination offers an ideal strategy to protect both these groups. And if we look at sustainable development goals put forward by the WHO by 2030, they want to reduce the global maternal mortality ratio below 70 per 100,000 live births, the neonatal mortality to 12 per 1,000 live births, and the under 5 to 25 per 1,000 live births. And if you remember the previous slide, there is still a lot of work to do. And just due to the fact that a lot of these deaths are seen in children and infants and mothers, and again, infectious disease related, maternal vaccination could contribute to these sustainable development goals. And this is the history of maternal vaccination. So during the last decade, the strategy went from being a taboo to a clear indication, as was seen by an increase in research on maternal immunization. So as you can see on the graph on the right of the slide, there was a huge increase in the number of publications on maternal immunization during the last 10-15 years, and this resulted in worldwide recommendations for maternal immunization. So as I already said, the strategy went from being a taboo to a clear indication. So first people thought that it was best to avoid vaccination during pregnancy, but then during the last years, there was a change in mindset. So people thought that mothers, the unborn child, and the child have the right to be protected during pregnancy. And this led to research on vaccination during pregnancy, resulting in recommendations for vaccination during pregnancy. So the concept of vaccination during pregnancy is a strategy with a triple goal. So first of all, this strategy wants to protect the pregnant women like we do for influenza and COVID-19. Secondly, vaccination during pregnancy wants to protect the fetus or the unborn child like we do for influenza, CMV, and Zika. And finally, this strategy wants to protect the newborn as we do for tetanus, pertussis, influenza, GBS, RSV, and COVID-19. So newborns, they have an increased susceptibility to infectious diseases at birth. And by vaccinating during pregnancy, we augment the amount of maternal antibodies in the pregnant women, and these antibodies are then transported towards the fetus. So in short, the concept of vaccination during pregnancy, so by vaccinating a pregnant woman, we boost levels of disease-specific IgG antibodies, and these maternal antibodies are then transferred across the placenta or the breast milk to the infant, providing protection against disease during a period of increased vulnerability until the infant is protected by its own immunization. So I already gave you a general introduction about the concept of maternal vaccination, and I have now a few specific examples for diseases for which already a recommendation exists, or diseases for which maternal vaccine is still in the pipeline. So a first disease of which I will talk about today is pertussis. So why do we vaccinate against pertussis in pregnancy? So on this graph, you can see the number of laboratory confirmed pertussis cases in England by age group between 2011 and 2014. And as you can see, the highest number of cases is seen in infants below 1 year of age, who are too young to be protected by their own immunizations or own vaccinations. And pertussis vaccination during pregnancy forms the ideal strategy to better protect this target group. And this is a map with the countries that had a pertussis vaccination during pregnancy program in place. And this is the situation in May 2017. And on the next slide, this is an update from December 2019. And as you can see, more countries already started to implement the vaccination strategy. And then finally, the most recent update from April 2023. So it is clear that over the years, when more scientific evidence became available, more countries started to implement this vaccination strategy into their national immunization schedule. So in general, vaccination of pregnant women during every pregnancy is recommended with 1 dose of an acellular pertussis containing vaccine. And the recommendations vary across countries in view of timing on when to vaccinate during pregnancy. So I will now go step by step through several aspects of this vaccination strategy. And the first aspect are the immune responses in pregnant women. So upon vaccination of a pregnant woman with a Tdap vaccine in pregnancy, a vigorous antibody response is seen with high titers in the pregnant women at delivery. But what we also see in those pregnant women, but also in the general population, is already significant waning of these pertussis-specific antibody titers 1 year after vaccination, which is exactly the reason why we vaccinate for pertussis at every pregnancy, because we want to achieve the highest antibody titers possible at every delivery to provide optimal protection to the newborn. And if we then look at the immune responses, if we compare immune responses between pregnant and non-pregnant women, we see comparable immune responses between pregnant and non-pregnant women upon Tdap vaccination. Another important aspect is the impact of priming during childhood on immune responses in pregnancy. So this is a recent study that was published in the US, where they looked whether AP versus W priming in childhood impacts responses to Tdap vaccination in pregnancy. And in this study, significantly lower antibody titers for PT and FHA were seen in neonates from AP versus WP primed women, and also a significantly higher proportion of infants with anti-PT levels below 10 international units per milliliter were seen in AP versus WP primed women. So this study clearly showed that infants born to AP primed women have less protection against pertussis in the first months of life. And this is an observation that certainly needs more attention in the coming years, as more women primed with AP vaccines in infancy will become pregnant over the years. So I already mentioned on one of my previous slides that Tdap vaccination is recommended during every pregnancy. And the safety of this vaccination strategy has already been demonstrated. But up till now, data on the immunogenicity of Tdap vaccination in successive pregnancies were not available. So at our university, we asked the women that participated in trials on Tdap vaccination during pregnancy to inform us if they would again become pregnant. So in total, we included 27 women that were vaccinated with a Tdap vaccine at 2 successive pregnancies. And from these women, we took maternal blood and cord blood at delivery. The mean interval between 2 successive pregnancies was 2.4 years. So in short, we showed that the maternal total IgG levels were comparable between both pregnancies, whereas the total IgG levels in cord blood were significantly lower for FHA, DT, and TT at the second compared to the first delivery. What we also showed in this study was a reduced transplacental transport ratio in the second compared to the first pregnancy for all Tdap included antigens. So the timing of vaccination in pregnancy is certainly an important topic for research, and in a review, they highlighted this research area as one of the priorities for future research on maternal immunization. And if we first look at the impact of timing of pertussis vaccination during pregnancy on the vaccination coverage, a recently published study from the UK showed that with the extension of the time frame from the 3rd trimester of pregnancy at implementation in October 2012 to the 2nd trimester of pregnancy in 2016, a higher vaccination coverage was seen in pregnant women, with more women that were vaccinated earlier in pregnancy. So 40% of pregnant women were vaccinated at least 13 weeks before delivery after the extension of the time frame. And if we then look at the impact of timing on antibody titers, several studies have already been conducted, but those studies report different outcomes. So this is a study from Latin America, where they show that the vaccination at 60 days or more days before delivery results in higher anti-PT IgG GMCs versus vaccination less than 60 days before delivery. So this study showed us that vaccination in the early 3rd trimester of pregnancy may be more effective than vaccination later in pregnancy. And also in a study we conducted with our research group in Thailand, we showed that the best timing to vaccinate to optimize the amount of transplacental transferred antibodies is at least 8 weeks prior to delivery. And this is a study from Switzerland, where they extended the time frame for vaccination from the 3rd to the 2nd trimester of pregnancy, and they looked at the impact of timing on both term and preterm born infants. And in this study, they showed that vaccination in the 2nd versus the 3rd trimester of pregnancy is more efficient for both term and preterm deliveries. And this is one of the most recently published studies on timing of vaccination during pregnancy on antibody titers. So this is a study from the UK where they looked to this topic in a more controlled way. So they randomized pregnant women in 3 groups according to their gestational age at vaccination. So a first group of pregnant women vaccinated at or before 20 weeks, 4 weeks gestational age. A second group vaccinated between 24 and 28 weeks gestational age, and then a 3rd group vaccinated between 28 and 32 weeks gestational age. And in this study, no significant differences in antibody titers between the groups were seen. What could be the reasons for the differences with the other studies I already showed is that in the study from Latin America, they only compared the early 3rd trimester of pregnancy versus later in pregnancy, whereas in this study, earlier time points were included. And compared to the Swiss study included a complete 3rd trimester, whereas this study only included the early 3rd trimester of vaccination. But despite the fact that no significant differences in antibody titers were seen between the groups in this study supports the recommendation to vaccinate at any time between 16 and 32 weeks gestational age. And also in a study that we did in Belgium, where we did a meta-analysis, so a multi-country analysis on a cohort of 698 mother-infant pairs, we showed that in term infants, the highest antibody titers at birth are reached if we vaccinate pregnant women before 31 weeks gestational age. And when we took together term and preterm born infants in this analysis, an interval of at least 7.5 weeks between vaccination and delivery results in the highest cord blood antibody levels. So also this study confirmed that vaccination in the second and early third trimester of pregnancy results in the highest antibody levels at birth. And besides the impact of timing on antibody titers, also an impact on the quality of antibodies is seen with this study from Canada, showing that vaccination between 28 and 32 weeks gestational age versus between 33 and 36 weeks gestational age results in higher total absolute avidity of anti-PT-IgG antibodies in cord blood. And the same observation was done for the interval between vaccination and delivery, with a higher total absolute avidity if the interval was longer. The impact of timing has also an effect on the vaccine effectiveness for the prevention of pertussis in infants below 2 months of age. So this the study from Winter et al. Showed that a higher vaccine effectiveness was seen if vaccination was performed between 27 and 36 weeks gestational age versus earlier in pregnancy, and also a higher vaccine effectiveness if vaccination was performed between 27 and 31 weeks gestational age versus between 32 and 36 weeks gestational age. Another study from the US, from Scoff et al. Showed a higher vaccine effectiveness with the first and second, lower vaccine effectiveness, with second or first trimester vaccination compared to third trimester vaccination. And the same observation was done in the study by Romanin et al. So from this, we can conclude that vaccination in the third and preferably in the early third trimester of pregnancy is most effective against pertussis disease in infants below 2 months of age. However, this is a very recently published study from the UK. They also looked at the impact of timing on vaccine effectiveness, and they saw no impact of timing on vaccine effectiveness, except if the vaccine was administered less than 7 days before delivery, a huge drop in vaccine effectiveness to 27% was seen. So at our university, we have currently also an ongoing study where we measure the impact of timing of vaccination on both cellular and antibody-mediated immunity in blood and breast milk, and on the transport of antibodies across the placenta. So in this study, we do not only rely on IgG responses for measuring the impact of timing, but we use a multidimensional approach where we, besides antibody titers, also measure glycosylation, avidity, subclass and binding to the Fc receptors of the antibodies. And we also look at the cellular immunity, including T cell subsets and cytokines. Another important research area within the field of maternal pertussis vaccination is the blunting effect. However, several studies that looked at this blunting effect used actually a different approach to look at this blunting effect. So this is why we published with a group of international experts on maternal immunization, a commentary paper looking at definitions and statistical approaches to study this blunting effect, in the hope that in the future, the studies will be more comparable. So as I already said, a lot of studies have already been published on this blunting effect, but the outcomes or the results that are published in these studies are not uniform. So some of the studies only report blunting after primary vaccination, whereas other studies also saw blunting after booster vaccination, and the antigens on which this blunting effect is reported are not always the same. So that's why we published a meta-analysis where we took together all data that were published on this blunting effect so far to increase the sample size. And when doing that, we saw that blunting was present after primary vaccination for all pertussis-specific antigens. And after booster vaccination, this blunting effect even persisted for most of these pertussis-specific antigens. The question that still remains is, when does this blunting effect actually occur? So is there a pre-existing level of antibodies needed to let this blunting effect occur? And can we prevent this blunting effect by lowering the pre-existing level of antibodies in the infant? So this is what they studied in a recently published study. So they classified infants in groups based on their IgG antibody titer at 3 months of age. So before they received their first pertussis-containing vaccination, and they showed that in infants with high pre-existing antibody levels, significantly fewer antibodies to all vaccine antigens except for TT were seen after the first vaccine dose, and there was even no increase in antibody levels after the first vaccine dose for all antigens. After the second vaccine dose, an increase in antibody titers was seen for PT, FHA, TT, and DT, indicating that the blunting effect was most present after the first vaccine dose. In this study, they also showed that despite this blunting effect, high neutralizing capacity is maintained. So this is one of the first studies that actually tried to define a cutoff level for blunting, and that clearly showed a correlation between pre-existing antibody levels and the occurrence of blunting. However, more research is needed in the future as the different groups were quite small. So throughout the world, there are still a lot of countries that are still using WP vaccination for their infant vaccination schedule. And if you think about implementing pertussis vaccination during pregnancy on a more broad scale, it is very important to know the effect of the presence of maternal antibodies on the immune response of infants to WP vaccination. So this is why we conducted a study in Thailand. So infants from Tdap vaccinated women were either vaccinated with a cellular or a whole cell pertussis vaccine. And in this study, we also included a control group of infants from non-vaccinated women that were vaccinated with a WP containing vaccine for their infant vaccines. So if we compared WP vaccinated infants from vaccinated and non-vaccinated women, we saw blunting of the infant immune response in the WP group after primary vaccination for PT and FHA, and this blunting effect persisted after booster vaccination. If we compared in the vaccinated AP and WP vaccinated infants from vaccinated women, significantly lower antibody levels in the WP group were seen compared to the AP group for all antigens after primary vaccination, indicating more blunting after infant WP vaccination. And these significantly lower antibody levels persisted after booster vaccination for FHA and PRN. So this study showed us that the blunting effect is even more pronounced in WP versus AP vaccinated infants, and that caution is needed when implementing pertussis vaccination during pregnancy in countries still using WP vaccination for their infant vaccination schedule. And what is the impact of timing of vaccination during pregnancy on blunting? So this is a meta-analysis that was published. And in this study, they showed that timing of vaccination during pregnancy did not impact antibody concentrations following primary vaccination. However, other studies that were published showed a clear correlation between antibody titers at birth and occurrence of blunting. So more research on this matter is still needed. And what about the clinical impact of blunting? So the exact impact of blunting on the children's health still remains unknown. As we have no correlate of protection available for pertussis, we don't know when protection is achieved. However, no increase in pertussis disease in countries with universal maternal immunization programs is seen over the year. For other diseases for which correlates of protection exist, children from vaccinated women reached seroprotective levels, making blunting less of a concern for these diseases. So in the future, surveillance of pertussis epidemiology in various settings using different combinations of maternal and pediatric vaccines is needed to further assess the clinical impact of blunting. And special attention is needed for countries still using WP vaccines in their infant vaccination programs. However, my personal opinion is that the benefits of protecting newborns during their first, most susceptible months of life currently outweigh the potential risks of blunting later in life. So the data I showed so far were all studies that were conducted on term-born infants, but as approximately 10% of infants is born preterm, it is also very important to know the impact of maternal antibodies and of vaccination during pregnancy on preterm-born infants. And this is why we started a few years ago a study in Antwerp, where we looked at the impact of Tdap vaccination during pregnancy on preterm-born infants. So as expected, preterm-born infants have an impaired transplacental transport, but these preterm-born infants have still significantly higher GMCs if they are born to a vaccinated versus an unvaccinated woman, showing that those preterm infants do benefit from vaccination in pregnancy. And what about the immune response in preterm-born infants? So in the presence of maternal antibodies, no influence of prematurity on the primary immune response to pertussis antigens is seen. And what we also saw in preterm infants was that there was no blunting effect, probably due to the fact that those preterm infants get fewer maternal antibodies from their mother. So preterm infants do benefit from Tdap vaccination in pregnancy. So there is an importance of timely vaccination to protect both term and preterm-born infants. And what about the long-term impact of maternal vaccination on the immunity of the child? So that's why we, in Antwerp, further followed children that participated in studies on Tdap vaccination during pregnancy on the long term. So we took blood samples before and 1 month after their vaccination with a pertussis-containing vaccine in the first year of primary school. And in this study, we saw a significant increase in antibody levels in both infants from vaccinated and unvaccinated women, with no significant differences between the vaccine and the control group 1 month after vaccination. So the blunting effect that we see in infancy is probably a temporary effect that is completely resolved after booster vaccination later in life. And then finally for pertussis, so besides the impact of pertussis vaccination during pregnancy on antibody levels in blood, also an impact on breast milk is seen. So we showed that maternal vaccination induces high anti-PT IgA and IgG antibody levels in colostrum and throughout later lactation after both term and preterm deliveries. And these immunoglobulins in breast milk, they provide additional local protection to the newborn, but up till now it is unknown whether these immunoglobulins ingested via breast milk can also offer additional systemic protection to the neonates. Then a second disease of which I will talk about today is COVID-19. So immediately at the start of the pandemic, it was clear that pregnant women were at increased risk for COVID-19 related complications. But despite the fact that we knew that, pharmaceutical companies did not include pregnant women in their initial vaccine trials. So at the moment, the first COVID-19 vaccines were licensed, no data were available in pregnant women. But despite the fact that no data were available in pregnant women, some countries immediately decided to implement this vaccination strategy into their national immunization schedule based on their experience with pertussis. And over the years, or over the last 2 years, a lot of countries followed, as you can see on this slide, where a lot of countries have now a recommendation for COVID-19 vaccination in pregnancy in place. However, currently there is no recommendation for systemic vaccination of pregnant women against COVID-19 during every pregnancy. So pregnant women should be up to date with their vaccination status in pregnancy and can be vaccinated in pregnancy if needed. However, in the US, they see a huge increase in the number of COVID-19 cases in young infants, and a possible reason for this could be that women that are now becoming pregnant, their last COVID-19 vaccine is already a while ago, so they don't have a lot of circulating maternal antibodies anymore, so they don't provide optimal protection to their newborn. So a question for the coming months is whether we need to implement maybe a systemic recommendation for COVID-19 vaccination in pregnant women. So as I already said, pregnant women were excluded from the original vaccine trials, and some countries, including Belgium, they implemented the vaccination strategy before research data were available. So at the moment in Belgium, that we prioritized, or that pregnant women were vaccinated with the COVID-19 vaccine, we started up a trial on COVID-19 vaccination during pregnancy called the PREGCOVAC study. So in this study, we included 64 pregnant women, of which 47 were vaccinated with a messenger RNA vaccine and 17 with an adenoviral vector vaccine. And all women received at least 1 vaccine dose during pregnancy, and blood samples were taken at several time points post-vaccination. So in both study groups, a significant increase in anti-RBD IgG antibody titers was seen following vaccination. However, at all time points, significantly lower anti-RBD IgG concentrations were seen in women vaccinated with an adenoviral vector vaccine compared to women vaccinated with a messenger RNA vaccine. And if we boosted those pregnant women, so all women were boosted with a messenger RNA vaccine. So by doing this, we created the heterologous and a homologous vaccine group. And after booster vaccination, the difference between both groups disappeared. So boosting with a messenger RNA vaccine closes actually the susceptibility gap or the immunogenicity gap that was created after primary vaccination. And if we then look at the neutralizing antibodies and the avidity of antibodies, also significantly lower titers were seen in women vaccinated with the adenoviral vector vaccine compared to women vaccinated with a messenger RNA vaccine. And also a lower transplacental transport ratio was seen in women vaccinated with the adenoviral vector vaccine. So our results, they confirm the international literature showing that COVID-19 vaccination in pregnancy elicits a multidimensional immune response with a better and a faster humoral immune response after messenger RNA versus adenoviral vector vaccination, but boosting with a messenger RNA vaccine closes the immunity gap. A more efficient transplacental transport is seen after messenger RNA versus AVV vaccination, and presence of anti-RBD IgG antibodies in cord blood is seen, providing protection to the neonates. And what about the timing of COVID-19 vaccination in pregnancy? So up till now, not a lot of studies have been published, but this is a study from Israel, and there they compared early versus late third trimester vaccination, and they saw higher anti-RBD IgG concentrations in the maternal blood with late trimester vaccination, whereas higher concentrations were seen in the cord blood with early third trimester vaccination. And also a higher median transplacental transport ratio was seen with early third trimester vaccination. This is a study from the Netherlands, where they divided pregnant women in 6 groups according to their gestational age at vaccination. But as this was a post hoc analysis, the groups were quite small. So women vaccinated in the third trimester of pregnancy, they had similar anti-spike and anti-RBD IgG at delivery compared to women vaccinated in the first or second trimester of pregnancy. And similar observations were done for the virus neutralization capacity. On the other hand, a negative association between cord blood IgG at birth and timing of vaccination was seen, with higher antibody titers in cord blood if the vaccination was performed earlier in pregnancy. The antibody transfer at birth through the human milk showed no significant association with the gestational age at vaccination. So in this study, they made like a compromise. So they said that early second trimester is the optimal window for balance of maternal and infant protection. And what about the timing between Tdap and COVID-19 vaccination, which is important as more vaccines that could be administered in pregnancy are becoming available. So in this study, they showed no significant difference in anti-S IgG levels and in the transplacental transport ratio if women, in addition to a COVID-19 vaccine, also received Tdap vaccine during pregnancy, even if the Tdap vaccine was received within 2 weeks of COVID-19 vaccination. So they advised no specific schedule between Tdap and COVID-19 vaccination, but as the groups were quite small, more studies are needed. At our research group, we also performed some studies on vaccine confidence in pregnant women. So I already said pregnant women were initially excluded from COVID-19 vaccine trials, and doubts arose in this target group about the vaccine safety, the immunogenicity, and the efficacy. And this resulted in lower COVID-19 vaccine acceptance in pregnant versus non-pregnant women. However, in Flanders, we saw that the uptake for the other maternal vaccines, like there is influenza and Tdap, was not affected by this lower vaccine acceptance, where we even saw an increase in vaccination coverage during pregnancy compared to the previous study in 2016. So in 2020, we measured Tdap vaccination coverage during pregnancy of 85% and a coverage for influenza of 62.3%, which is one of the best coverages actually measured throughout the world. And we also did a study where we looked in more detail to vaccine confidence in pregnant women across Europe. So we performed an online survey in 11 European regions, and we questioned pregnant women and women who delivered in the last 2 years about their vaccine confidence. So in total, we included 25 women per country, except for Flanders, where we included 480 women. So in general, a low vaccine confidence during pregnancy below 50% was seen in countries like Bulgaria, Slovenia, France, Germany, Austria, and the Netherlands, with the lowest vaccine confidence in Bulgaria, which is the only country with no maternal vaccination program in place. The vaccine confidence during pregnancy was higher in regions such as Poland, Finland, Flanders, Italy, and Spain. And if we compared vaccine confidence during pregnancy versus vaccine confidence in general, the vaccine confidence in general was higher than the one measured in pregnancy. So this highlights the need for clear, scientifically based universal maternal vaccination programs, and also the need of proper training of healthcare practitioners taking care of pregnant women. And this is RSV, better known as respiratory syncytial virus, is actually a disease for which currently a maternal vaccine is in the latest phases of development. So it is estimated by 2 years of age, virtually all children have been exposed to RSV, resulting in 33 million new episodes of lower respiratory tract illness in children below 5 years of age globally, with 3.6 million hospitalizations. Also, 26,000 deaths due to RSV lower respiratory tract illness and 100,001 RSV attributable deaths occur yearly. 97% of these deaths occur in low and low middle income countries, which leads to the fact that the number that is showed on this slide is probably a serious underestimation of the true burden of RSV. And 45% of all these RSV-related deaths occur in infants below 6 months of age. So for the moment, the only licensed preventive strategy for RSV in infants are monoclonal antibodies. So no RSV vaccine is licensed yet for maternal or pediatric vaccination. Recently, 2 RSV vaccines for elderly have been approved. So this is the RSV development pipeline. And as you can see, for the moment, 2 vaccines are approved for elderly, one from GSK and one from Pfizer. And we also have access to 2 types of monoclonal antibodies that can be administered to infants. And for maternal and pediatric vaccines, a lot of vaccines are in the pipeline, and some of them are in the late stages of clinical development, so phase 3. And these are the results of the maternal RSV vaccine from Pfizer, showing a very or a good vaccine effectiveness against severe RSV-associated lower respiratory tract illness, and also against RSV-associated lower respiratory tract illness, with also a very good safety profile in pregnant women. So this vaccine is currently submitted for licensure and will hopefully become available in the coming months. And then a last disease is GBS or group B streptococcus, for which also maternal vaccine is in the pipeline. So it is estimated that in 2020, 90.7 million pregnant women were colonized with GBS. And this leads to urinary tract infections, preterm delivery and stillbirth in pregnant women. And if children are infected with GBS in the first months of life or during delivery, this can lead to early or late onset disease and even death. So it is estimated that GBS is responsible for 50% of life-threatening infections in newborns during the first 3 months of life. And it's also responsible for 10% of all preterm deliveries. And if a woman is colonized with GBS, colonization of the placenta occurs in 5% of cases, likely resulting in impaired fetal growth. So for the moment, the prevention of GBS is limited to intrapartum antibiotic prophylaxis. But the problem is that in the regions where GBS is most common, people often don't have access to this antibiotic prophylaxis. And also the use of a lot of those antibiotics can cause antibiotic resistance. So currently the only viable long-term option to prevent GBS infection is a maternal vaccine that can be administered to pregnant women. So for the moment, 3 GBS vaccines are in the phase 2A of clinical development. So it will still take a while before these vaccines are licensed, but hopefully within a few years, we can say that the first GBS vaccines are licensed. So last but not least, I want to thank all my collaborators, but especially my colleagues from the University of Antwerp, without whom this research would not have been possible. Thank you. If there are any questions, I'm happy to answer these.
Thank you, Kirsten, for your clear presentation on pertussis, COVID, RSV, and GBS immunization in pregnant women, and of course also the consequences in infants and preterm infants. This is now open for questions. Let me first start with asking you one question that might be important also to explain to the audience. You were mentioning that you were looking at the effect in preterm born infants.
Yeah.
Can you tell me, how do you create a cohort of mothers with preterm born infants? Because you don't know that at the moment of pregnancy.
So that was a quite difficult one, because if you include pregnant women and then you wait until they deliver preterm, you need to include a huge amount of pregnancies. So we went daily to the maternity ward of hospitals here in the neighborhood, and we recruited them postpartum when they just delivered. And when they just delivered, we asked whether they would participate in our study, which was not evident, because at that moment that we asked them to join our study, they just gave birth preterm. So it was really not easy to recruit this cohort of infants, and it took a few years to recruit them. So it was really a challenge.
Thank you. As far as I understood from your presentation, looking whether there are new questions, there are no new questions as far as I can see. But as far as I can understand from your presentation, timing of the immunization during pregnancy can be vaccine specific, or let's say, or maybe even vaccine platform specific. Is that also the case with all the vaccines you have been looking at so far in the literature?
I think it is vaccine specific, because depending on which target group you want to protect, it impacts the timing. So for influenza, you mainly want to protect the pregnant women. So timing of influenza vaccination during pregnancy is really depending on that. Whereas for pertussis, the main target of protection is the infant. So you need to adapt your timing to optimally protect the infant. So it's really vaccine specific. Whether it is a vaccine platform specific is something that is not yet studied, because for pertussis we only have one vaccine available, or one vaccine platform available. And for COVID-19, for example, they did not look yet to whether there is a difference in timing, optimal timing between the different vaccine platforms. So that's something we need to look at in the coming years, certainly if new vaccines will become available to be administered in pregnancy.
Thank you. Any questions from the audience? Janina, do you see any questions in the chat? Because I don't see any questions. Yes. Oh, no.
I also there's one.
We have one from Maertens Saba. Hello, Martin. For the Pfizer RSV vaccine, there are some concerns about preterm births in the vaccine group. Was this a concern for the other vaccines in pregnancy?
So I'm not really aware about a concern of preterm births in the vaccine group. So articles that were published so far did not really show a correlation between RSV vaccination. Now for the RSV vaccine,
yeah, RSV,
sorry,
yeah.
I was COVID. I was reading COVID-19. So for the COVID, for the other vaccines, it was a concern in the beginning, like they wanted to check it, but for all those vaccines, it was thoroughly checked whether there was a risk of adverse outcomes when administering vaccines in pregnancy, and none of these risks were there. So for the other vaccines that are currently licensed, there is not really a correlation between administering the vaccine and preterm birth. And for the Pfizer RSV vaccine, they saw some signals, but as the vaccine is currently submitted for licensure, I think they clearly sorted out that there is no correlation, because otherwise it would not be submitted for licensure. So I think they really looked at it.
Okay, thank you. And just for clarity, so far there are no RSV vaccines licensed for pregnant women.
Not yet.
Only for elderly.
Only for elderly.
Adults,
yeah, only for elderly, and then we have the monoclonal antibody, but it's an antibody, another vaccine.
Okay. Looking again at the chat, so feel free to type your questions in the chat so that we can answer them. I also see that Janina put a message in the chat for the accreditation with a form, so those who fill in the form can then also return it to Janina Leckler, so that this can be prepared. So far, no other questions. Kirsten, and it's easy for me because I'm sitting just in front of Kirsten, so I can do even an interview with Kirsten. Can you say something more about ongoing projects or future projects that are on your mind that you really want to conduct with your team here?
Yes, I think an important future thing is if the RSV vaccines would become available for the pregnant women, what will be the ideal strategy to use? Because you have the monoclonal antibodies, you have the maternal vaccines. So which strategy is the best one to provide optimal protection to the newborn? When should the vaccine be administered in pregnancy? If you administer a vaccine in pregnancy, do you still need to administer monoclonal antibodies? Or are monoclonal antibodies enough? And when would you administer those monoclonal antibodies? So these are still questions that are open for future research once those vaccines are licensed in the future. And also the acceptance of pregnant women to those new vaccines in pregnancy, which will be an enormous challenge in the future as more vaccines are becoming licensed and pregnant women are advised to receive a lot of vaccines during pregnancy. I think, confidence and acceptance will be an enormous challenge for the future in this research field.
Thank you. I see so far no other questions among the audience. I'm checking the list of participants, whether I see any hand. I don't know, Janina, whether you see any further questions so far.
No, I don't see any raised hands or questions in the chat. If there will be any questions afterwards, feel free to just write me an email and I can pass that on to Kirsten. Maybe questions are coming later. You just have to think about it a little.
For sure, it was a lot of information that we received. And if we have no further questions, I would like to thank Kirsten Maertens from the University of Antwerp to participate in this VACCELERATE webinar series. And I'm sure that we will get further updates from Janina on the future webinar series in the coming months, perhaps after the holiday period. So thank you all very much, and thank you, Kirsten.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Yeah, thank you very much from my side also, Kirsten. It was a pleasure to have you here. We recorded the webinar and will upload it on YouTube. And we will send you the information on the next webinar that will take part in July, just before the summer break very soon. Have a good day, everyone.